The Australian Financial Review.
Earlier this year, Financial Review senior writer Greg Barrett sat down with a lifetime shoplifter.
Like I'd drive up north, down south, Wollongong, I'd Google it on my phone and just stop on the way, bang, 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 then drive back, bring the bloke and get rid of him.
He wanted to understand the rise in retail crime across the country.
How many would you do in a day?
6 to 10, depends how many were on that way. I'll pick a destination and say, all right, and Google all the ones on the way. Coles and Woolworths, the Chemist Warehouse, pharmacies.
How much could you net in a day then?
I remember one day I got 6,000 bucks.
The shoplifter, who didn't want to use his real name, started out stealing for himself. But in more recent years, it was for an organised crime syndicate.
But he had multiple people employed, so he had people bringing baby formula, vitamins, all to order. He'd give you what to target.
This type of organised theft has started to hit the profits of some of the biggest companies in the country and was the headline story of this year's reporting season.
This is the work that has been done to get the laws right here in Victoria, and the Parliament has the opportunity to get these laws passed and have them in place before Christmas.
It reached such a crisis point that in the lead up to Christmas, state governments introduced new laws.
So crime is a game of risk versus reward, and so hopefully these measures will change that equation and increase the risk and reduce the reward.
Welcome to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray. This week, Greg Barrett and senior reporter Carrie LaFrenz on what's behind Australia's retail crime wave, why Victoria is ground zero, and whether facial recognition technology is the answer. It's Thursday, December 11. Hi, Greg. Hi, Carrie. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Oh, no worries, Liz.
Hi, Lisa. Thanks for having me.
Carrie, one of the biggest stories of reporting season this year was the impact on businesses from retail crime. And this ranged from thieves with knives hitting rebel stores to the targeting of meat departments and meat shelves at Coles and Woolworths. Why is this sort of crime happening and on the increase, and why is it in the headlines?
So, Lisa, I've been covering retail for about 4 years now, and I've never seen retail crime come up as much as it did this past reporting season. Almost every presentation that I went to, all the CEOs were talking about crime and rates of violent incidences with staff. It was actually quite shocking. Super Retail Group chief executive at the time, Anthony Herity, he revealed that Rebel Stores, which is owned by Super Retail Group, were really being hit hard down in Victoria. Thieves were taking items like golf balls, tennis rackets. He said it was really scary, and sometimes they even came in with knives. Then there's Rob Scott, CEO of Wesfarmers.
Well, we've seen a very similar experience to other retailers. And
he's one of the biggest retailers in the country. They own really well-known brands like Bunnings, Officeworks, and Kmart.
Look, I think the reason why all retailers are calling it out, including ourselves, is we care deeply about our team members, the safety of our team members, and also the safety of our customers that are coming into our stores.
He made it very clear that this was not a surge in opportunistic crime by petty thieves. It was really about organized crime. So another CEO that talked about retail crime this past reporting season was Daniel Agostinelli. Now, he's the CEO who runs Accent Group. It's one of the biggest shoe retailers in the country. They own brands like the Athlete's Foot, Hype, UGG. And, he was less worried about theft in store because, of course, as a shoe retailer, you have one shoe on the wall and all the stock is back behind.
One shoe out the back.
Yeah, that's right. However, he really expressed concern about what was happening wider in the mall space. There's knife fights and crime.
Would this be the death of them all?
Actually, yes. He said he was worried. He brought up about the machete brawl at Melbourne's Northland Shopping Centre earlier this year, and he was quite concerned about people just not coming to the mall anymore on the weekend to hang out and shop. Supermarket giants Woolworths and Coles have also been targeted, not only with theft, but higher rates of incidences of violence against staff. Woolworths CEO Amanda Bardwell reported a 26% rise in violent incidents at its supermarkets in the past year. Myer executive chairwoman Olivia Worth in September said her business as well has spent about $25 million over the past few years in an attempt to minimize theft across the department store chain. cosmetics, perfumes, Lego, and brands such as Tommy Hilfiger. Incidents of staff being threatened had also climbed significantly. She said that these types of incidences had risen by an alarming 80%.
So, Greg, after this retail crime wave was highlighted again and again during reporting season, you were asked to look into it and write a feature with Carrie for AFR magazine, and that's when you sat down with Steve, a lifetime shoplifter, and got the perspective from the other side. What did he tell you about why this type of crime is on the rise?
Steve grew up in Woolloomooloo in Sydney, which is right next to King's Cross. And he grew up in the 90s when there was a major heroin influx into Sydney, and it was a pretty rough suburb at that time. He grew up in a family with a single mother and was kind of, in a way, born into a life of crime. Steve first went to jail when he was 12.
Right.
He first tried heroin when he was 15. And he spent, from his mid-teenage years till his 40s, 16 years in jail. So he's had a lot of time to contemplate the risks the risks and rewards. And so Steve was essentially a thief who broke into shops and stole cigarettes and broke into safes. But that was a very, very risky crime. His preferred crime, in a way, was shoplifting because it was easier and the consequences for getting caught were much less. So Steve showed me his shoplifting box.
So you can make a foil-lined bag, line it with hairdresser foil, and the metal detectors won't go off.
It looked like a big Christmas or birthday present, and it was in a bag.
So you could walk in and out with it. I've actually had staff grab me and say, I seen you walk in the dressing room with 5 pairs of tracksuit pants and they're not in there anymore. And like, I went, mate, look, it's a birthday present.
And you wouldn't think anything of it. But the box was lined with foil, which knocked out the store's security systems. Steve would go in, there was a card on the top which he'd flip, he'd fill it full of goods, and then walk out of the store with all these goods. And the security alarms wouldn't go off. Steve was stealing to support his heroin addiction, and he also spent the remainder on gambling. He told me that the best day he got out of his shopping bag was $6,000. So that's not $6,000 worth of goods, it's $6,000 that he got. And he was stealing to order. So, yeah, he'd had a long involvement in shoplifting. So it was interesting to talk to him. But he said that it's kind of virtually been decriminalised.
With shoplifting, people know they're not going to get, nothing's going to happen.
In that the chances of getting caught are so slim, and then the consequences when you do get caught are not severe.
You know, like, it was a slap on the wrist.
And so compared to his other crimes where he'd get years in jail, shoplifting was kind of a slap on the wrist. But he was also able to explain the changing nature of crime. So despite what people think, theft or property theft is actually down enormously from 2000. There's been a great crime decline in Australia. So house burglary is down, car theft is down. You know, you used to be able to steal a Holden just by jumping in and hot wiring it. Now you've got to steal the keys. And the goods in your house are not worth anything either. It's harder to steal money from shops because there's less cash. But the thieves have moved into shoplifting because it's easier. He told me this story in the early 2000s. He and his friends would break into office buildings and steal like 20 laptops and get $1,000 per laptop. Well, now those laptops are worth nothing. And so there's been this great shift in crime and it's all moved into retail.
And it's so interesting to get his perspective because, as you say, it is a lifetime of crime.
Yes.
How much more organised is it now?
I think a lot more organised. So I think, you know, when Steve started shoplifting, it was to get his wardrobe or to get some clothes or whatever. But by the end of it, he was stealing to order.
Yeah, so he had people bringing baby formula, vitamins.
He had as he said, a Chinese guy out at Ashfield.
All to order, you know, I mean, he'd give you like what to target.
Who would tell him what he had to get. It might be baby formula, it might be electric toothbrushes, might be something else. And he would go out and steal those goods to order. One of the things I found interesting is that electric toothbrushes are hot for thieves. It might be a particular brand that is popular in Vietnam. The thieves will come in with the brand name and steal all those toothbrushes and they'll be sent off to Vietnam. But it's all very specific. So it was much more organised than I had thought.
So that it is organised crime.
Yeah, 100%.
Carrie, this retail crime wave has been building over the past few years. Coles Chief Executive Leah Weckett was the first boss to sound the alarm a few years ago, but at the time she was a lone voice. Why was that?
So, Lisa, that's right. In August 2023, at the company's full-year financial results, Weckert said the stock loss had risen about 20% over the previous year. That really shocked the market. Mm-hmm. People were totally unprepared to hear that kind of figure. This figure also includes food wastage, but this was mostly due to theft. So this was a huge number, which really hurt the company's margins and profitability, and it caught many fund managers by surprise.
Coles really jumped on it. They got the jump on the other retailers too. I mean, there was an interview with one of the other major retailers at the time, and he was sort of saying, oh, look, this is just a COVID bounce, nothing to see here. But they were wrong. It was escalating at a rapid pace.
But 2 years later, it's a really different story, and Wesfarmers is now one of the loudest voices on this topic.
Okay.
At Wesfarmers, executives say gangs of thieves are targeting two of their big retailers, that's both Bunnings and Officeworks, and the thieves steal to order.
We've always had shoplifters, and the retailers have always dealt with that. But this big increase, they say, is organised crime. It's targeted. It's looking at particular goods. They can see through their sophisticated monitoring that this is organised crime.
And Greg, as you say, Coles now has that first mover advantage because they've been putting the systems in place for a few years to combat shoplifting. You spoke to Coles about this and got a tour of one of their stores and the tech they're using. Tell us about it. What are they doing?
So I spoke to the wonderfully named Matt Swindells, who's a senior Coles executive. And Matt was saying that it's really much worse than it's ever been. They noticed this uptick in shoplifting a few years ago.
We spent a couple of $100 million of investment in technology in the last 2 years to address the issue.
And since then, they spent $200 million.
Wow, $200 million.
$200 million.
It's a big investment, and we did it very quickly.
On initiating anti-theft schemes. So one of the most lucrative products for thieves to steal is meat. And they will go in and sweep whole shelves of steak off.
So then they're not going across the whole store taking bits. They would sweep entire sections of meat and then go and sell on to cafes and restaurants.
And then run out the door with a trolley.
And blatantly do that into trolleys and just walk out. It is that blatant.
In the Maribyrnong store that I went to, they showed this new technology which is called weighted shelves. And it was pointed out to us by one of the security guys. He swept 3 trays of meat off into his trolley. And an alarm went off straight away. There was a TV camera that was above where you could see, so the thief could see that they were on the camera. That alarm was picked up by the Coles Central Security Service somewhere in Melbourne, and the security guards were also alerted. And an alarm went off in the shop saying, this store is monitored for theft. You know, it was all incredibly sophisticated.
What if you were a family and you just were taking 3 trays of meat?
You'd probably select them pretty carefully. You'd be there looking at the rump.
One by one.
One by one, rather than quickly sweeping them off into your trolley. It's not just meat, it's the cosmetics section too. All the cosmetics, the expensive cosmetics, were behind plastic doors.
Yeah.
And you had to press a button to get that door open. There were lasers pointed at the deodorant. They had locking gates that stopped someone from running out with a trolley. They now have guys who can actually intercept those people. They wouldn't tell me how they do it. You know, they're trying to change the equation and the risk versus reward. The other thing that surprised me was that they have actual surveillance teams that will follow these shoplifters from the store to where they're taking the goods. It allows them to be able to track gangs. They then compile all this information and they take it to the police. And the guys there were incredibly disappointed. They'd say, we'd kind of wrap all this up in a bow for the police, take it to them, and then they'd sit and wait for months, sometimes watching their stores getting ripped off day after day by the same people waiting for the police to act.
But they did make arrests in some cases.
They did. When we talk about organised crime, it's not bikies and people shooting each other up. This is a different sort of crime. And this was highlighted by one of the gangs that was uncovered in Melbourne by Coles. Coles identified through this sophisticated surveillance a bunch of international students who'd been shoplifting in various gangs all around Melbourne, and there were more than 100 people involved in this syndicate. They'd stolen more than $10 million worth of goods. 19 people were charged for alleged crimes, and those matters will appear in the courts in the coming months. The frustration comes that there's lots and lots more of these gangs, and they know that if you take out the head, then you can make a real difference, because they need this organisation behind them to shop their goods to. What kept coming up time and time again throughout investigating this story was how bad things are in Victoria. And this was in all of our interviews, with not just with Coles, was that Victoria was ground zero. Victoria is home to a quarter of the population, and yet Coles data indicates that a whopping 71% of all of its organised crime losses occur in its Victorian stores.
We're talking about the retail crime wave in Australia that is starting to eat into the profits of some of the country's biggest companies. Greg, why is the problem most acute in Victoria? As you said, the state is home to a quarter of the population, but according to Coles, over 70% of organised crime losses at its supermarkets happen in that state. Why?
So Victoria really is ground zero.
Crime in Victoria is at record levels.
Victoria's crime epidemic has reached alarming new heights.
Victoria had 82,000 separate incidents of retail crime.
Victoria recorded the biggest jump in theft with a 29% increase.
Everyone we spoke to, all the retailers, said it is so much worse there than anywhere else in Australia. It was difficult to get an actual conclusion on this. There's something to do with the long lockdowns, that they were worse in Victoria than in any other state. But Matt Swindells, who's got a look at the national profile, he says it's largely due to a kind of a poor process in Victoria with the police. In South Australia, the retailers can report crime online and it's instant. In Victoria, you have to go into a police station, you have to report it. It's just a very cumbersome system. And one of the IGA stores that we spoke to, that they're out in the western suburbs of Melbourne, they said that the police never turn up. And so there's kind of a breakdown between the retailers and the police in Victoria. They point to South Australia as being the best state, and they've got an online reporting system. They also have a dedicated retail crime squad. And so the incidents of shoplifting and incidents in store in South Australia are minimal compared to Victoria. South Australia also has meaningful punishments for offenders, and this has had a real effect on the crime in that state. Last year, assaults, threats and abuse in Coles Victorian stores rose by 45%. In South Australia, they fell 13%. And Melbourne has a long history of organised shoplifting. So the Kangaroo shoplifting gang that went to London and cleaned out London I think it was in the 70s, all those guys were from Melbourne. And it's kind of got this long history of having organised shoplifting gangs.
And didn't some retailers point to the long COVID lockdowns in Victoria as contributing to the crime surge?
Matt Swindells was really good at explaining what happened during COVID.
In COVID, really, supermarkets kind of lifted and became essential services. The sentiment of the public towards the supermarket team in particular changed.
When COVID first started, supermarket workers were seen as kind of heroes, keeping the country running while the pandemic was on.
The loss came right down. So actually we had this drop, almost like a nation rallying at a point in time.
And then there was a cost of living crisis, and the supermarkets were accused of price gouging, and they went from, hero to zero in a very short period of time.
But post-COVID, when inflation then hit, we went from being essential services heroes to inflationary economic villains.
And that led to poor behaviour in the stores against staff and an increase in shoplifting. And Carrie, it's the same in Bunnings.
Well, it was interesting. Bunnings Managing Director Mike Snyder says something really changed during the pandemic. It's almost as if the fabric of society was altered. In particular, Victoria, where lockdowns were quite extreme at that time. And so Wesfarmers CEO Rob Scott also agrees, and he's been very vocal and been pushing for changes to the laws.
And so the problem was reaching a crisis point. And in August this year, 20 retailers wrote to Premier Jacinta Allen demanding action. They wanted a change in laws, and those changes are starting to happen now. And other state governments are also looking at tougher laws to crack down on shoplifting.
So let's talk about those tougher laws. The Victorian government did respond to the demands from retailers, and new laws were passed just last week aimed at addressing the crime spike. Similar changes were also introduced in Western Australia. Carrie, what are the states doing?
So in Victoria, new laws are in place ahead of the busy Christmas season, which is great news for retail. It will be an offence to assault or threaten a retail worker, and those charged could face up to 5 years in jail. So a ram raid is where the criminal drives a vehicle actually into the shop and steals goods. This will now be recognised as an aggravated burglary, which carries a maximum penalty of 25 years in jail.
And so the penalties are getting tougher. Is it what people expected? Are they happy with what's been introduced?
All of these laws are welcome news, but they were really first promised last year. So the government seems to be dragging its feet a little bit. And there's been a lot of vocal voices from the Australian Retailers Association all the way to executives about pushing things through a little bit faster, particularly in the state of Victoria. And the latest laws stop short of including a provision for workplace protection orders. However, the Victorian government does have plans to introduce new laws to establish these workplace protection orders against violent individuals. But that's not happening until next year. These are the kind of people that are repeat offenders. These are the kind of people who are violent offenders, and that's who these laws are targeting. It's like an AVO, but for retail. They're currently only in place in the ACT, but in WA, the government is introducing similar laws, and what that means is this will allow courts to ban violent or threatening individuals for up to 2 years. So earlier this week, I went out to Kellyville Woolworths in Sydney. I had the opportunity to meet with Amanda Bardwell, the CEO of Woolworths.
We want to talk about one of the things I think we've made the most progress on as a retail industry, workplace protection orders.
She was adamant that the workplace protection orders were a very significant development for the retail sector.
To see that go from being just in ACT 6 months ago, now to see that in almost all states with an intent to legislate, game changer for us.
And Carrie, retailers are also responding, and as Greg said, Coles is at the forefront of this, using technology in its stores to try and get ahead of the problem. But it can be difficult, as we saw with the backlash against Bunnings, which used facial recognition technology, or FRT as it's called, in its stores to prevent theft. People weren't happy about that. What happened in that case, and is FRT something we'll have to get used to in the future?
So FRT has become somewhat controversial technology. It's not actually illegal to use this technology, but there's really strict privacy laws around the use of this technology. And what happened over at Bunnings is it got into some trouble because it basically started using this technology but didn't inform anybody. Now, they were adamant that this was just about preventing thieves and preventing those violent people from coming in store. However, the Privacy Commissioner ruled that Bunnings actually illegally collected sensitive biometric data from shoppers in its stores between 2019 and 2021. This is a problem because there was no consent given by the shopper.
There were concerns in New Zealand where they'd done a test of this about over-collection, scope creep, surveillance and misidentification and bias. And when you look at how many data leaks there have been from companies of your personal information, your credit card details, your bank details, I think we should be concerned about our facial details as well. They say that they're going to keep it safe, but there's been so many incidents where our personal information hasn't been kept safe. And I don't think that you should have this risk, going into Bunnings on a Saturday, buying a leaf blower and having your facial details put out on the dark web. I spoke to the Privacy Commissioner, Carly Kind, and she said that using FRT would be a huge change in the way our society is run, and that there should be a proper debate about this and it should go through the Parliament, not just be a decision of the retailers.
The Retailers Association says it's vital that regulators work with the retailers responsibly to deploy FRT to protect the frontline worker, which is facing a higher rate of violent crime. Retailers, particularly people like Bunnings and even Kmart, its sister store, who also was sanctioned by the Privacy Commissioner for illegal capturing this data on hundreds of thousands of individuals in their stores, they still are a proponent of the FRT and say that it's absolutely necessary to protect their staff. Bunnings is now appealing against this finding, and every retailer is really watching this case very closely to see whether it gives them the green light to roll this out in their own stores.
So governments and retailers are really focused on this crime spike. Now that CEOs are speaking out and governments are introducing tougher laws, is that enough to bring this crime wave under control?
So Coles has spent about $200 million in the last couple of years on reducing theft rates. And it's not just about profitability. It's also about protecting their staff. Supermarkets, many young people get their first job in retail right across the sector, if it's working at a shop or stocking shelves at Coles or Woolies. And they're often really not equipped to challenge or to deal with these high rates of theft incident. And the retailers now are having to spend quite a bit of money in simulations of what it's like to be in a violent incident. So chief executives, sure, they're worried about profitability, but they're also worried about staff safety. I think that it'll be really interesting to see what happens with the FRT, because I don't see this issue going away, and that could actually help prevent incidences if it's used appropriately. Next year, we're going to see what happens with the workplace protection orders. Those are those laws we talked about before that are almost like an AVO, but for the retail space. Both staff and chief executives are all wanting to see crime drop, rates of incidents drop, and they're hoping that these laws will really make a difference in terms of violent crime against retail workers.
Well, at least something had to be done, and this Christmas will kind of really be the test of whether or not this tougher approach on crime is working. Because it's really unacceptable that kids who are starting in their first job would be subjected to this violence and to even abuse, really. Matt Swindells has got a couple of kids who work in Coles, and he said he's just come across these incidents which were just horrible, even with his own kids. And I just don't think that's acceptable in Australia today. And it needs to be a coordinated approach that helps all the retailers, because what we found was that the smaller retailers like the IGAs and whatnot, when Coles and Woolworths introduce these sophisticated anti-theft measures, they feel the squeeze. They feel that thieves are then pushed out to their smaller stores. So it's important that they be given some help as well. So crime is a game of risk versus reward. And so hopefully these measures will change that equation and increase the risk and reduce the reward.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks, Carrie.
Thanks, Lise.
Thanks for having me on the show, Lisa.
Thank you for listening to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray, with the Financial Review's Greg Berup and Carrie LaFrenz joining the podcast today. The Fin is produced by Alex Gow and Mandy Coulin. Fiona Buffini is Head of Premium Content. Our theme is by Alex Gow. If you enjoyed this episode, send it to a friend, as it helps others find us, and follow us wherever you get your podcasts. For more stories about markets, business and power, subscribe to The Financial Review at afr.com/subscribe. See you next week.
The Australian Financial Review.